All right, welcome to today's seminar as part of UVA's assessment of China's Belt and Road Initiative project. My name is Tayyab Safdar, and I'm a postdoc here at the Department of Politics and the East Asia Center, University of Virginia. We are joined today by an extremely distinguished scholar, Professor Marlene Laruelle. She's the director of the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. She's also co-director of PONARS, the Program on New Approaches to Research and Security in Eurasia, and the director of the Liberalism Studies Program and the Central Asia Program as well. She's a research professor of international affairs. She's written lots and lots of books on Russia, Central Asia generally. And today she'll be talking about an extremely important topic as China's Belt and Road Initiative continues to expand across different parts of the world. Marlene will cover a very extremely important area, the Eurasian heartland, so as to say, and she will be talking about Central Asia's perceptions of the BRI, hopes and concerns. Marlene will speak for around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have question and answers at the end. Over to you, Marlene. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be able to discuss with you and to present you some of the research I've been doing on Central Asia perception of the BRI and more globally of China. Let me share my screen. So you should be able to see it now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, just trying to extend it. Yeah. So briefly, I won't present the BRI globally because you are all more specialist of it than me, but I will be presenting just a few words about what is happening in Central Asia on the ground related to the BRI. Then discussing the BRI and the question of Russia, which is, of course, for Central Asia, a big issue. They need to have both Russia and China working together and not confronting each other to have things functioning on the ground. And then more in depth, we'll be looking at Central Asian public opinion, perception of China, and I will show you several surveys that have been done quite recently. And then I will be discussing how can we identify the different Xenophile and Xenophobic groups that are growing and consolidating in Central Asia. And you will see it's a pretty contrasted view depending on who is who in the different Central Asia countries. So the first point, let me just move the things, is that for Central Asia in their relationship to China, there are specific issues, right, compared to other BRI countries. The first specificity is, of course, the territorial contiguity for Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, which share a border with China. That's quite important on the way they are looking at China, because as you may know, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, these three countries had to renegotiate border delimitation treaties with China. And so in a sense, their first encounter with China once the Soviet Union collapsed was around border issues. And China was pretty tough in the negotiation, and that kind of contributed to create some tensions, especially, in the three of them at different levels, and I'm happy to give details after if you have a specific question. Another important element that makes Central Asia quite specific in its relationship to China is that you have a quite important Uyghur minority in Kazakhstan of about 300,000 people. And so as you can imagine, the links between this Uyghur diaspora and what is happening in Xinjiang is quite tight, and that has put a lot of pressure on Kazakhstan in trying to maintain good relationship with China, especially with what is happening now, the re-education camp for Uyghurs, and where also some ethnic Kazakhs in Xinjiang are sent. So that's a kind of very political sensitive issue, especially for Kazakhstan. And then globally, the region still has a strong memory of the Sino-Soviet conflict that has been cultivated by Soviet and then post-Soviet Russian media. And so globally, the relationship to China was a very careful and reluctant one at the beginning of the 90s. And then it evolved, and I will be telling you more about that. But so What is key here to realize that because geography and history matter, that make that the Central Asian interpretation of the BRI will be very much looking at both territorial and cultural components are being key in the relationship. So it's not only about investment, it's also a lot about territorial fear and territorial cultural fear. And I will be giving some more example after. So what is important for Central Asia is that to realize that the BRI has to be put in a broader framework, right? That China already become Central Asia first trade partner since the 2008 crisis. So until then, Russia was the first economic partner. After the 2008 crisis, China took the lead. Depends on the country. Sometimes the EU is leading, sometimes it's still Russia on some specific like energy trend, but globally in terms of trade, and of course of investment, China is leading. In fact, China began really rising in power in Central Asia around 2005, 2008, 2010. So when the official BRI project was launched in 2013, for the Central Asian state, it was more the kind of achievement of something that was already existing than something new, right? And very much for Central Asia, the BRI is a kind of repackaging of existing projects that have been implemented by different Chinese corporations on the ground before the official launch of the BRI. The other specific point for Central Asia is that even if the BRI is very important, you also have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that is still seen as China really important conduit in the region because that's where Russia and China are negotiating their security partnership. So BRI is very important for investment, of course, but the SCO is still very important also for the Central Asian state. And so they always try to look at both BRI and what it means in terms of Chinese involvement into the security field and the relationship with Russia. So you see that's a kind of specific frame of Central Asia and its relationship to the BRI. Very generally broad data that where you can see China trade over with Central Asian state really boomed in the second half of the 2000 and then in the mid 2010s. Russia has been very, very far away now. And of course, China is the first investor in Central Asia that has become very visible since the last decade. And for people like me working on the post-Soviet space, we tend always to say that China has been replacing the Soviet Union in terms of being the main investor in infrastructure, in modernizing and creating infrastructure in Central Asia. In fact, it's much more China than Russia who is following the step of the Soviet Union, of course, in a totally different economic context. But just to show you that for Central Asia, China is such a key partner that it's almost an unavoidable one because the choices are quite limited in terms of investment partners. So what are the dilemma for Central Asia? The key issue for them is that they are very much landlocked, as you may know, especially countries like Uzbekistan, double landlocked. So everything related to development of continental trade is for them the key issue because it's very difficult for them to be able to reach any kind of sea port. They like the fact that China is giving investment in infrastructure without too much political string attached. There are still some that are attached, right? Like related to the Uyghurs issue, to the One China theory, the relationship to Taiwan. So all these elements are of course present, but what the Central Asian state likes is that nothing related to governance or human rights in the investment that China is offering for the region. And then the Central Asian states also like the fact that China has been trading with the region, offering really kind of low quality product, but also quite an expensive product that really helped the Central Asian societies move from the difficult period of after the collapse of the Soviet Union to a world where you can more or less buy whatever you need if you have the money. And so on that, China has been really a key element or the key embodiment of accession to consumer culture for the post-Soviet Central Asian population. But of course, that has a high cost. The cost is that the Central Asian economy are kind of pushed toward being more and more exporter of raw materials. And that's, of course, one of the big critique against China, that is just exploiting the subsoil of the region without helping developing economic kind of industrialization or transformation of the product. There have been the feeling of Central Asian states losing control over many of their economic industrial sector, and I will come back on that. That's very, it's a very sensitive topic, especially in Kazakhstan, where each time China has been trying to rent agricultural land, that has created usually huge protest against Chinese presence in the agribusiness sector. Another key issue, very negative, especially for the two small countries in the region, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, is that their state debt toward China has been increasing. It's now about 60 to 80% of the Tajik debt is linked to China, depending how you make the calculation. It's a little bit less for Kyrgyzstan, but it still means that these two countries are usually in debt toward China, and that has global potential consequences in terms of political and geopolitical sovereignty of these countries. And that will go back, and I will go back after, to the relationship between receiving money and investment from China and being potentially limited in terms of border potential renegotiation that China would ask in the region. That was, as I was saying at the beginning, the territorial issue is still a very sensitive one for Central Asia. Another key aspect of the BRI presence in the region is how it is articulated with the fact that Russia is still the first symbolic regional leader in Central Asia. As I said, economically, Russia is second or third after China and sometimes the EU. But in terms of security assistance and just kind of political power involvement in the relationship with Central Asian regimes themselves, Russia still play a key role. And so far, the Russia-China division of labor has been working pretty well. Russia understood that China is dominating economically, and China knows that Russia should be respected as the kind of the security provider for the region. The relationship is pretty stable and working well. Of course, when China launched the BRI, the reaction in Moscow was not a very happy one. They at the beginning considered it was, of course, a competition with them. So they launched the Eurasian Economic Union as a way to create a trade and custom union that would be potentially able to slow down Chinese trade. That didn't really work. And so in 2015, Moscow changed the narrative and created what they call Greater Eurasia, which is a purely empty discursive tool that articulate positively the Eurasian Economic Union and the BRI by saying that Russia and China are working together in building this huge continental trade bloc against the US unipolar system and so on. So they have the discursive tool to make the two projects not being competitive, but in fact, of course, economically, Russia is retracting. But as I said, what is key for Moscow is to have security and military partnership more kind of important than the economic one. And even if China is trying to grow its presence in the military sector in Central Asia, it's still very modest and trying not to kind of go too much over Russia traditional domination. And in a sense, the two countries have this culture of strategic avoidance of each other. And I think both Moscow and Beijing are very much aware that they have so many tensions with the US related to Ukraine for Russia, related to Taiwan, and globally the trade war with the US, that they really try to avoid any kind of conflict over something that wouldn't be worth enough. And I think Central Asia is that both countries, even if they sometimes compete around the new BRI project, they try not to make a big deal of that, because their partnership on the global scale is much more important than what is happening on the ground for Central Asia for the two of them. So that's what the kind of the broad overview of this BRI or Chinese presence in Central Asia. If we now move on how the Central Asian public opinion are receiving China's presence, I will show you several surveys that have been done in the region. So this one is the classic Gallup one done every year about approval of Russia, China, and the US. And so it's a mix of 4 countries over the 5. We don't have the information for Turkmenistan, which is a very close country. So usually there is no survey done there. And you can see that the favorability to China is better than the US, but really not better, lower than the Russia one. And so it's about 20, 30% globally of positive opinion of China, which is not very huge. Russia is always at more than 50%. And as you can see, the US, depending on the general geopolitical relationship between US and Russia, is going back and forth. And you can see the 2014 big low of favorability for the US in Central Asia related to the Ukrainian crisis. So China is okay, but it's still not doing very, very well in terms of favorability. Here I show you another survey that has been done in 2020, part of a big NSF project looking at all the post-Soviet country, and you can see China is the 4th one. And after the US, it's still the country where the majority of Central Asians would like to have less presence than more presence, right? So less presence being in red. So 55% of the populations in Central Asia would like less Chinese presence. Only 12% would like more. So it's here also you can see the reluctance of Central Asian societies who feel that they already had so much of Chinese presence these last 2 decades that they are really not interested in getting more. And then briefly, I show you several slides of all the surveys done by Central Asia Barometers and the Eurasian Development Bank Integration Barometer, just to give you an overview of how Central Asian population are projecting themselves geopolitically between Russia, China, and the US. So you can see that, of course, Russia is considered as the most friendly country. China is also, it's the one in red, is let's say appreciated by a small kind of 15 to 10 to 20% of the population. And you will see Kyrgyzstan is always the most critical of China in all the surveys we have. If you look at China being interpreted as an unfriendly country, you can see that it's 15% in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan seems to be the one that worry the most, with Kyrgyzstan about China. Tajikistan is usually much more positive. And then if you look like something where China is appreciated, where it has more positive results, for example, is in terms of sending children to study Chinese in China. And you can see, for example, in Kazakhstan, that makes suddenly China a little bit higher than what it was before. Going to work in the region is not very much, in China is not very much valued, right? Because seen from the Central Asia perspective, studying in China is good, working in China doesn't sound very attractive. And here's something interesting where everything related to culture, you can see that China is doing very low. So there is no Chinese cultural soft power, while no one in Central Asia is kind of asking for more cultural soft power from China. It's really not valued. If it's about investment, you can see that China is a little bit more appreciated, and that you have, let's say, like 1/5 of the population, at least in Kazakhstan, who like more Chinese investment. Even more when you ask about technological cooperation. So that's the sector where Chinese presence is valued compared to the more kind of political or cultural presence. So just to give you an overview, and each time in the surveys, you can see how much Russia is rated high, China in the middle, and the US rated very low. And I'm happy to discuss more later if you have any question on these surveys and on the differences also between the 5 Central Asian countries. Here I show you the 3 that have a border with China, the 2 other without any border with China, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. They are much more difficult to penetrate in terms of doing surveys, so we know less about the public opinion, but they have less tensions with China and not this kind of accumulated cultural fear because China is further away for them. So what they see of China is mostly the economic aspect and not the kind of more cultural or territorial risk. Now, if we try to move to identifying who among the Central Asian population is having pro-Chinese or anti-Chinese narratives, we can identify several interest groups, right? The most pro-Chinese group in Central Asia are the ones who are in power, right? The head of state and their family are usually very positive about China. All the big public companies are very positive about China because, of course, they do business with China. And all the kind of private oligarchs who are also selling product to China, being raw materials, construction, storage, communication, are all kind of claiming their support to China and to the BRI project, which all makes sense economically, of course, because they are the one gaining from the relationship. But you can imagine how it is also interpreted by the public opinion, which is that, well, all these elites group are Sinophile because in fact they are corrupt by Chinese money, right? So that's very much the way it is interpreted, is that China is corrupt, contributing to aggravate the corruption of the Central Asian elites. In reality, it's much more complicated than that. Of course, is that you don't have a lot of choice for the Central Asian state in terms of investment. Russia is promising a lot, not doing a lot in terms of investment. The West is mostly absent from investing in Central Asia. You have some kind of big project by the Asian Development Bank, but globally, in terms of identifying one country, China seems really the most generous. So it's obvious that for those who are the political or the economic elites, there is no other choice than to partner with Russia and then with China, and then to, of course, celebrate the BRI project. If we look at who are the anti-Chinese groups, and that has been accentuated, in fact, with the launch of the BRI, we can really see several small constituencies. One is, of course, those who are in political opposition in Central Asia, so those who are the democratic political opposition, who consider that China is kind of supporting the authoritarian nature of the Central Asian government. The nationalist opposition, which I will discuss that later, is of course very much shaped by a fear of China on many cultural issues. We also have something that was very much there in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that has re-emerging now, is that it's environmental groups that are denouncing Chinese BRI investment as being very dangerous for the environment. And because the Central Asian countries have shared border, there are a lot of tension around water management that has always been a key issue, especially between Kazakhstan and China. So all these environmental groups, because the discussion about environment is kind of growing in Central Asian countries, suddenly these groups become more vocal in criticizing the BRI project in the region. The Islamist group are also usually very much anti-Chinese, but they are also anti-West and anti-Russian, right? But they are very vocal in denouncing China as a dangerous country, as a country that dislikes Muslim culture and that is oppressing its own Muslim. And so that is also because the Central Asian societies are becoming more and more Islamized in terms of their moral and their cultural values and references. That narrative about China being an enemy of Islam is also growing. Then we have the question of the Uyghur diaspora, which by definition, if I may say, is very critical of the Chinese government. And since the beginning of the so-called re-education camp in China has been finding itself in a very difficult situation. So China is pressuring the Kazakhstani authorities to pressure their Uyghur diaspora to be sure there is no support to the Uyghur in Xinjiang. And so they have some oppositional movement that try to resist that oppression, but that's of course very difficult for them. And then you have a whole spectrum of different social groups that are anti-Chinese because the way they have been interacting with Chinese firm or Chinese trade has been perceived as very negative. So a lot of petty trader, small entrepreneur always find themselves in competition with Chinese investment and Chinese workers in the region. So they have been There have been a lot of, tensions, riots in bazaar against the Chinese trader, and that has been going on since in the early 2000s. They are also growing. So the more China is having assets in the region, the more they are encountering between Chinese expatriate worker and local villager. And usually that clash very regularly. So there are tensions where in the villages where the Chinese firms are present, there are usually tensions with villager all around the same classic topics like, they are not respecting our women, they are not respecting our culture. So all these kind of very classic cultural tensions. And then we have had several protests of Central Asian working in Chinese firms, protesting for, salaries, working condition, environmental risk. And so that has created really now one of the key elements in the Central Asian public opinion discussion of China is everything related to work condition, to the fact that Chinese firms are in fact preferring hiring Chinese citizens than local citizens, and therefore they are not contributing to giving job to the people on the ground. So all that has really become a very sensitive question, and it's very difficult for the Chinese firm to find a way to fight the growing anti-Chinese feeling related to work condition. At the same time, you have a rise of xenophilia in the public opinion in terms of looking at China as an absolutely extraordinary opportunity. And as you can imagine, seen from Central Asia, where many people don't dream about going to the West because it's too far away, don't want to go to Russia because it's perceived by some as the kind of the former colonial center. The options for kind of creating a path toward modernity and economic prosperity is very limited, right? Iran is not a model, Afghanistan is a counter model, Turkey is not very much a model except for a small minority. So many young people, and that we have a generational effect there. Many young people are seeing China as an opportunity. They know that if you learn Chinese, you will have a kind of guaranteed social promotion, good job opportunity, good salary. And so there has been a really kind of fashion for learning Chinese in Central Asia. And the fact that China has opened in Confucius Institute in the whole region has, of course, contributed to that. And so now Chinese is the second foreign language learned by Central Asian after English. And I don't count Russian as a foreign language in Central Asia. It has a specific status. But so really you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Central Asians who are, sorry, I have the little one around. A lot of young Central Asians learning Chinese. And that's also for them a way to be globalized, right? Their first encountering with going abroad is going to China for learning. But what we have in several studies that is really interesting is that in fact Central Asian wants to learn Chinese, but they don't want to learn anything about China, right? They don't care about Chinese culture. They don't like Chinese culture globally. So it's really a purely kind of instrumental, transactional learning of Chinese for job opportunity, but you cannot really see, at least so far, a kind of functional Chinese soft power that would make China globally attractive to the Central Asian elites. And the reason for that, and that's a key element that I've been mentioning several times, is that the level of cultural fears against China is still very high, right? So for the older generation, you still have all the old Soviet anti-Chinese cliches that are still working very well. For the younger generation, which can be more attracted by China, you still have the idea that China, as I was saying, is seen as the traditional enemy of Muslim and Turkic people. And of course, what is happening now around the Uyghurs is kind of reinforcing that narrative. China continued to be seen and regularly denounced in Central Asian media as an imperialist, a colonial power that in fact would like to take more territory from Central Asia. The issue, as I was saying, of agricultural colonization is an ultra-sensitive one, especially in Kazakhstan. So the government each time had to kind of retract for any promises it made to China to rent to give China some arable agricultural lands for Chinese presence. And of course, globally, the demographic disbalance is, of course, playing in favor of China and making the Central Asian ultra sensitive to all narratives about, oh, there is a kind of yellow peril, Chinese migrants are arriving and occupying our country, we are invaded by Chinese. So all these kind of fears are still very much shaping the presence of China. And globally, there is a fear, and that's a very old, historically, fear for Central Asia, to be suddenly integrated culturally and kind of sinicized culturally. And of course, what is happening with Uyghurs now is playing against China very much with this notion, and that's very spread in Central Asia, that what China is doing now to the Uyghurs, it will be doing to us in a few decades if we don't find a way to culturally resist to China. And what I've been noticing, like going to the region really, really regularly since the early 2000s, is that I remember in the first half of the 2000s, people saying like they wanted more presence of China to counter the presence of Russia. And then in the late 2000s, the narrative reversed. People were like, it's good we still have Russia around because we have now too much of China. And there is this very interesting feeling that, okay, China is unknown and China culturally is too colonial. China would make us disappear culturally as a nation, while Russia can also be imperial, but we know the Russians, we have been sharing state with them for the last 150 years. We know how to deal with Russian, we don't know how to deal with Chinese. Right, so key element that here also will be very difficult for China to overcome, even if it continues to promote investment and infrastructure in the region. So some kind of concluding remark, and then I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Is that so China is playing several roles today in Central Asia, right? So globally, it has been protecting the authoritarian regimes of Central Asia with this frame that has been well studied, kind of illiberal solidarism. So being sure that these regimes are kind of protected from Western political interference, and on that, China and Russia are playing together. But China is now doing even more by, selling all these smart city project, artificial intelligence project that are all the internet control, all these tools that the Central Asian regimes are buying from China that will help them consolidating the authoritarian nature of their regimes. The fact that Central Asia and China share the same territory make that everybody clearly understood that China's return to Central Asia is a definitive return, right? That the Soviet parenthesis of having China almost absent is done, probably forever, and that now China will progressively become the key actor for Central Asia and Russia will be only second. So everybody in Central Asia has that view very, very clearly. As I was saying, the elites and some part of the population are Sinophile, not really because they are attracted by anything Chinese, but just because they feel there is no other choice for economic development for the region. At the same time, there are more and more criticism of the BRI project because elites are realizing that being part of a transcontinental network and all the buzz around the so-called connectivity, that doesn't create jobs on the ground. That can create transit fee for elites, but there is no money really going at the level of the population in creating jobs. And for Central Asian societies, whose half of the population is still rural population, if you don't create job on the ground, then people will emigrate and leave, right? And that's what is happening. The level of migration from Central Asia is huge because there is just no job. And China is in fact not helping creating job. And that will be probably one of the main criticism that China will have to address in implementing the BRI project. The lack of transparency and everything related to corruption and to environmental damage is also a growing question for some groups, advocacy groups in Central Asia. But what really matters for the majority of the population, I was saying, it's everything related to this cultural fear that China doesn't really know how to address. So the Chinese soft power seems very limited. Excepting promoting Confucius Institutes, so far it's difficult to see if this China succeeded in selling something else that learning Chinese as an economic opportunity. And then globally, there is this feeling in Central Asia that, okay, China will be number one, but Russia will remain the main counterweight to China. So paradoxically, that may play in favor of Russia around what I was explaining, that people in Central Asia feel they know how to deal with Russia while they don't know how to deal with China, right? So all that to tell you that this BRI is only one element among many other of Chinese dominance in Central Asia. It's very much discussed, but what I think is on the long run, the key question for the Central Asian states is that if China is staying only in the economic, if China stays as the economic hegemon of Central Asia, that's one thing. That is also creating a lot of problems, but that's manageable. But if suddenly China uses its economic leverage over Central Asian states in a more political or security or geopolitical aspect, then the Central Asian states will find themselves in such disbalance of power that the fear of, China asking to renegotiate the border delimitation treaty, that China asking the Central Asian states, to culturally accept, to sinicize themselves, all these elements are really perceived as a kind of the long-term risk for Central Asian sovereignty as state and as nation. So you can see that all this economic aspect of the BRI in Central Asia, they are entirely kind of embedded into fear that are much more at the cultural level, and kind of, imagined community of the nation that just purely the economic aspect. And of course, if also China become more involved in the kind of political security field, it may clash with Russia more rapidly, which is also something that the Central Asian states don't have interest to. So you can see how, seen from Central Asia, the BRI is key, and at the same time, it's just one element among a huge kind of China, really the elephant in the room now for the Central Asian states.